Hi everyone, welcome to the weekly politics show with me, Councillor Puru, and my co-host, Councillor Andrew Wood. There's been a last-minute change of schedule. So obviously, we've had the death of Prince Philip, and because of that, all major political parties have suspended their campaigning and also told their candidates not to do any media appearances. So Murad had to do a last-minute cancellation, but we'll make that up next week. So today's show is going to be, we're going to cover four big topics. One is we're going to discuss what's happening in Liverpool and Croydon, the crisis in those councils. Is it relevant to Tower Hamlets? What are the issues in Tower Hamlets? Can it happen to Tower Hamlets? And we're going to look at in terms of housing and the issue around the Davenant Centre. And then we're going to move on and discuss air pollution and the debate around that and what is actually happening with that. And then in the final segment, we're going to just go through the London election. You got 6th of May, Assembly and Mayoral, and the topic and the main issues, which is crime, housing and transport. So join us after the break and we'll go straight into Liverpool and Croydon. Can it happen to Tower Hamlets? So join us after the break. Hi everyone. Welcome to the weekly politics show with myself, Councillor Puru, and co-host Councillor Andrew Wood. Now, I just want to update the listeners. We've had the death of Prince Philip, so all political parties have suspended campaigning, which also means that their candidates are not going to do any media appearances. So Murad gives his apologies. So he says he wants to join us next Friday. So next Friday, hopefully we'll have a Conservative candidate as well, and then we could have an interesting debate with going through London issues and having perspectives from both sides of the political spectrum, as well as the candidates. So we're going to have a slight schedule. So the first topic we're going to discuss is the issues around council failure or failed local authority states, not failed states. So there's been a Croydon Council and a Liverpool Council have been in the news. The commissioners have gone in to take over. Both have had sort of like systematic failures. One is financial competency, and the other one is good old-fashioned corruption, I think, but there is a police investigation. So I'm gonna give it over to Andrew, who's read the reports in quite detail. So Andrew, do you want to go through the main issues with these two local authorities, because they're at different sides of the end of the spectrum? One is London, and there's London issues, and the other one is Merseyside, which has its own issues as well. And there's some interesting figures from history named in that report, sort of ish, especially someone with a permanent tan, who looks younger and younger every time I see him on TV. But do you want to go through the main issues that were found in the external government report and who actually did the report?
Yeah. So both councils are really interesting in sort of different ways, and I should emphasise at the very beginning, we're not exactly like them. So Tower Hamlets is different from both of them. But when you read the reports, you kind of think, that sounds familiar, or that's the same as us, or that's different from us. And I think one of the other interesting things about this, given the debate about the sort of the mayoral referendum and leader in cabinet, is actually Liverpool had a mayoral system. So Joe Anderson was the mayor, their only mayor so far from 2012. And he has been arrested on allegations of sort of corruption related sort of to building development contracts. But obviously he's innocent until proven guilty. Yeah. And Croydon actually is a leader in cabinet model, but Tony Newman was a councillor in charge. And it's very interesting when you compare the two, that actually they seem to have pretty much the same power in both models. So it does kind of show you that actually in both models you can have really strong figures who are dominant. And what was very interesting in the Croydon one is they kind of talked about, it was very unclear what cabinet members were responsible for and what they did, even though this is meant to be a cabinet and leader system. So I think, some of the claims that a cabinet leader system therefore automatically involve a bigger team of people was disproved by Croydon. But what went wrong in Croydon was basically financial. Is they spent a lot of money, they didn't spend it wisely. Some of their investments failed, and then COVID hit, which then had an immediate financial impact on them. So, for example, they bought a hotel called the Croydon Park Hotel, and then like within a year, they closed it, and then they bought the Colonnades retail centre, again about a year before COVID shut down most of our retail centres. And also, more interestingly for us, is that they had a company called Brick by Brick, which was basically investing public money in building homes, affordable homes as well as private for sale homes. And they've poured in, hundreds of millions of pounds into that company. And the company has not yet repaid any money to, or at least last when they did the report, hadn't repaid any money to Croydon Council. So all this money is going into this big black hole, and nothing is coming out. And the reason why they're investing in a shopping centre, a hotel and property, other than just the affordable housing element, is that all of them were supposed to generate money that would go back into the council coffers and help alleviate some of their financial challenges. Interesting, Tower Hamlets Council planned to do the same, and we set up also 2 housing delivery vehicles. One is like a charity, and one will also develop private sector housing. We did that back in 2017, and nothing has happened. So, so it's interesting that actually, because Tower Hamlets Council is so risk averse, that actually in this particular case, they have avoided some of the risks that Croydon did. And then Liverpool, as I said, it was the mayor had been arrested, and then the government appointed commissioners to go in, and a gentleman called Max Caller, who we know from Tower Hamlets because he was our commissioner here, went in and basically wrote, quite a devastating report about some of the things that he found about property sales, about a lack of documentation and how things were changed. And he also, at the beginning of his report, he wrote about something called Conquest's Third Law of Politics, which I'd never heard of before. But I thought I'd read it out, because actually when I sort of read it, it kind of sounds very similar to Tower Hamlets. So anyway, apparently Conquest's Third Law of Politics is the behavior of any bureaucratic organization can best be understood by assuming that it is controlled by a secret cabal of its enemies. So cabal means like a group. So basically what he's saying is, like, for Liverpool, you could best understand what was happening in Liverpool by sort of assuming that all of the enemies of Liverpool City Council were organising things behind the scene to put it in its worst possible perspective. Because when he sort of dug up into the detail, he found, as I said, a lot of problems. So their issues are less financial, but a little bit like Tower Hamlets, also an area of huge regeneration, huge investments, lots of property going on. And Croydon is also similar. Croydon is probably the one place in the UK that's competing with Tower Hamlets for the height of their buildings. So even though it sounds like these places are very far away from us, is actually they're very similar to us in some respects, which is why the reports are so interesting.
I think Croydon is kind of interesting in the sense that a lot of councils don't have the same exposure as Croydon, but a lot of councils are in the same position as Croydon. So you've got Tory and Labour councils. So I think is it Kent or Surrey? They've invested in a shopping centre, and they borrowed money against the Public Works Loan Board. And at that time, there was concerns that, look, you're putting a lot of money into a shopping centre. What if that shopping centre doesn't pay out? How are you going to pay the loan back? And then you got nearer down the road from us, Barking Council, which is the Labour-run council, have been fairly aggressive, and I think their development investment vehicle has lost money recently as well. I saw a report on one of the local newspapers in regards to that. So it seems like there was a trend where local authorities borrowed a whole lot of money, and I've seen articles written on it where it's kind of like going around the borrowing restriction that the Treasury has done, and there's billions of pounds have literally been borrowed and invested by local authorities, and it seems if the economy goes south even further, we're going to have a lot of local authorities in similar positions. It's a bit like those local authorities who invested in Iceland, in those bank accounts. There was quite a lot of them exposed in that, it just seems like the systems of checks and balances are not there. And Croydon is interesting in the sense that there's been a lot written about certain conflicts of interest as well that have been waved through. Inside Croydon has done quite a lot of writing, and for example, one of the things that sticks out was the chair of the planning committee, who's an architect himself, but they waved through the conflict of interest issues, made an exception of that. And I think he was behind, or he was one of the key figures behind the house building company. Have you? Is that what your reading of the situation is? It's more governance than financial.
Yeah, so it's very clear, and it was what I also find very interesting, and this is where it's relevant to us, is both councils had opposition parties, both councils had like the normal audit and scrutiny committees, and yet the opposition and the wider sort of councillor group seemed unable in both authorities to stop or even to be aware of kind of what was going on. So one of the things I sort of said in audit committee a couple of nights ago was, there are things I know that are happening in the council. So for example, back in 2017, we agreed to spend 140 million pounds on buying, homes in Tower Hamlets and outside of Tower Hamlets for homeless families and, for accommodation. It's now 4 years later. I have almost no idea where that money was spent, what we bought, where it went. I have a little bit of a clue. I mean, I know in one area we spent more money on Poplar Harker properties than we originally agreed to. But other than that, I have no idea what that money was spent on. And that's very similar to Croydon, is that they were spending all of this money and councillors actually didn't know on what it was being spent, unless, because these are big public purchases, other people were reporting what was going on. But the reason why this is happening, so I was actually looking at Woking. So Woking Borough Council and Surrey have been the leaders of this. And their idea is you borrow huge amounts of money from the government at very low rates of interest, and you buy lots and lots of assets. And those assets then generate, rental income and all the rest of it. So their calculation, so a month before lockdown started, is their investment income was equivalent to 88% of their total services budget. So logically, and they were basically aiming, I think they said they were going to achieve 98% if COVID hadn't hit. What that would actually mean is that in Woking, you could basically cut council tax to zero because your investments are basically paying for all of your council services. So if it works, it's a brilliant idea because it basically means residents don't have to pay any council tax. Unfortunately, whether that's going to work or not is a little bit unclear, because they did buy lots of commercial assets just before COVID made those commercial assets less valuable. And that's what some councils have done. But to be fair, there are other councils who weren't quite as reckless in Croydon, and we don't hear about them because they haven't gone belly up or they haven't had financial problems. So I think Newham have done some interesting things, and I'm aware of some other councils, have bought solar farms. So they bought a solar farm that generates electricity for their own council buildings, which then saves them a lot of money on electricity. So I think it can work if it's done, prudently. But in the case of Croydon, it went badly wrong, unfortunately for them. So
we're gonna. So the issues are what are the relevant issues in terms of Tower Hamlets? Now, just to explain to the listeners, Andrew and I sit on the audit committee. So the audit committee's job is for us to audit the council and see whether it's meeting its legal and financial obligations to be. So it's like a check on decisions. We look at decisions after they've been made and see if they what kind of consequences. But there was loads of interesting things. Croydon and Liverpool were discussed, and there's some interesting issues in terms of Tower Hamlets that have come up. Not exactly the same, but in terms of governance, it's come up. So join us. We're going to go into a break. After the break, we're going to discuss what are the issues in Tower Hamlets. We're not the same as Liverpool or Croydon, but can we have system failure? Let's call it system failure in Tower Hamlets. And are there any warning signs of that? So join us after the break where we go into how these apply in terms of what kind of lessons we could learn in application to Tower Hamlets. So we're going to go to a break.
ICL Call, a smart and reliable way to make international calls. Now you can call from anywhere in the world using ICL Call app without any roaming charges. You can also use our pinless services, not only in the UK but also from Europe, and call your loved ones abroad with competitive rates. Use ICL Call service from your landline, PC or any mobile phones. Register free on www.iclcall.com and start using the service that suits you.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the Weekly Politics Show with myself, Councillor Puru, and co-host Councillor Andrew Wood. So in this section, we're going to discuss what lessons can be learned in Tower Hamlets and how do they apply it from Liverpool and Croydon. And we're going to focus the discussion on what Andrew and I discovered and other members discovered on the audit committee in terms of Tower Hamlets councils, because it did come up in the discussion. So, Andrew, I just want to go over to you. In one of the tweets you did from the audit committee, you mentioned the housing waiting list. So, sort of, it's a bit like the Chicago election roll, in the sense that we discovered that there were people there on the waiting list who have actually passed away. So we always get this number of 20,000 or 19,000 families on the waiting list. But what happened was they did a bit of a deep dive into this waiting list, and it discovered that some people are no longer here with us, and other people have moved out of Tower Hamlets, so they're no longer qualified to be housed in Tower Hamlets. Andrew, do you want to go through sort of like your analysis of that finding in terms of the housing waiting list as symptomatic of can Liverpool and Croydon happen in Tower Hamlets?
So it was one of the more shocking audit reports I've read. I mean, I sort of read sections of it and kind of my mouth dropped because it was really shocking. And I'll read out some of it to you in a second. But basically what happened, so the internal audit team, they're a special separate team within the council of auditors. They kind of go to different departments and they kind of, look at what's being done. And what they quite often do is they kind of pick some test examples and then kind of dig into the detail. So what they sort of did is they kind of picked 20 people on the housing waiting list and then kind of did some digging as to find out, what happened to those 20 people. So they're picking 20 people at random. So the 19,000 people on the housing waiting list, which is a number on the council website right now, is kind of one of the most well-known numbers about Tower Hamlets. It drives a lot of the decision making because it's just too many people on the housing waiting list. But one of the interesting things that they did is they looked at 20 people who applied in sort of 2019, between January and October 2019, who applied to be on the housing waiting list. And it found that 13 of those 20 had never bid for any properties whatsoever on the housing waiting list. Why? We don't know. Maybe not because of COVID, because COVID kind of happened in sort of March 2020. We know that did have an impact, but these were people who joined in the first half of 2019. Was it because they were applying on their housing association's own sort of systems, not being picked up by the council? Maybe, but we just don't know. But that was quite shocking. And then some of the other things that they sort of found were, so they looked at 20 live applications from people on the housing register who were aged between 80 and 103 years old. And they found that of those 20 people, 5 of them had actually moved away from Tower Hamlets at some point in the past, and we just hadn't picked that up. And 11 had unfortunately died. But the last time they sort of checked this group of people was back in 2014. So they haven't checked, whether people had died in 7 years. And one of the things they did say in the meeting is that they would restart sort of checking whether any of those 19,000 people had died. But they were talking about doing it as an automated way, and I'm not sure that's going to be very accurate. Another thing they kind of looked at 20 people who've been on the housing waiting list the longest. And it said that there had been some people on the housing waiting list for between 30 and 40 years. So imagine waiting for a property for basically your whole of your adult life. And it also found that the last time this group of people were checked was back in 2015. And even then, not all of them were checked. And what they didn't do is actually find out as to how many of those 20 were still kind of active. Another really shocking one was that 2 of the 20 people they checked were homeowners. Now, basically, you're not allowed to bid for council housing if you have your own home. So the answer we got at audit committee was that those 2 people were elderly, and one had subsequently died, and one had applied for sheltered housing. But it's still not entirely clear, because I'm still not clear that should allow you to have access to social housing if you have your own home. But given some of the issues in the past, given that 2 Tower Hamlets councillors have gone to jail for having social housing and owning their own properties, I kind of thought that was really surprising. And the other point was there were no notes on the system to explain why those 2 people were allowed onto that housing waiting list. There was also no evidence that people, whether they've been checking people's incomes, because you're not allowed to bid for social housing if your income or your joint income is over £85,000. But there was no evidence that those checks had been done. Maybe the checks had been done, but they just weren't being evidenced. And then the last one was out of the 20 people they checked, 5 of them that there was no evidence of that they checked their identity or checked that actually lived in Tower Hamlets for 3 years. Again, maybe they did, but there was no evidence that they did. So what it basically suggests in summary is we have some people on the housing waiting list who are no longer actively interested or bidding because they've passed away or moved away. We have a group of people who are not bidding, and I don't understand why. Yeah, I can guess, but I don't understand why. But it's also very clear that the last time they were doing checks on people in the housing waiting list was at least 6 years ago. Well, that would suggest in the last 6 years, lots of people have joined the housing waiting list without either proper checks or reviews. And it may be that those people, most of those 19,000 people are on the list correctly, but we no longer, I certainly have no longer any confidence that that is correct, because you could interpret this as saying is actually of those 19,000, maybe half of them aren't real bidders, and that's a very different number. But I can't be sure, because all we have is this one audit report, and it's clearly something we need to follow up on.
Yeah, it is kind of shocking that the level of lack of information, especially on something like a core service that the council provides, and housing is the major topic in terms of Tower Hamlets politics and the main driver of a lot of the decisions here. The other shocking, on the back of that audit committee report, the other thing that happened, I think the next day, is the Davenant Centre, where they found a cannabis farm. And so just to give people a background, this is a council-owned property that was gifted to a trust, where the council has an arm's length relationship with the trust. They have a council officer sitting on the trust. And what happened was police basically raided and found a cannabis farm. And it's literally in the heart of, it's not in some far away place. It's literally off Whitechapel Road. We're just across stone throw away from the new town hall, actually. So it's kind of symptomatic of like what is happening with Tower Hamlets council properties, and why are there sort of like checks being done. And there's other questions as well, like the council is a major landlord. We own a lot of properties, we let them out. Like you have a lot of the shops in Tower Hamlets, the landlord is the council. Do we know what's happening in those buildings? Are they being used for crime? Are the real owners there? Are they subletting it to someone else and making profit out of it, which they're not supposed to do without the council's consent? And also, are they being used for the purposes that they told the council? There are restrictions on what activities you could do in terms of are they being used? So, Andrew, what are the lessons from Davenants? What's your take on it, and what are the lessons that we need to learn from it?
So, I mean, the difficult one about the Davenant Centre is, the council don't have a direct day-to-day role in managing it. They have an interest in the property, and they have a council officer on the trustees. But clearly, because of those interests, it has become quite a newsworthy story. And I know the police found it quite funny as well, because Councillor Peter Goals went down to have a look and was talking to the police, and they were showing him around inside the building, and they thought it was quite amusing, which in some ways it is. And the slightly more concerning thing is, I hadn't realized this, but somebody shared the tweet with me again, is actually on the 12th of February, the police raided the exact same building following reports that it was being used as a cannabis cafe. And the picture the police put up is of the same hall where the week or a couple of days ago, they raided it and then found 300 cannabis plants inside. So I'm a bit concerned that what happened in February wasn't picked up by the council to try and find out what was going on. But yes, we do have a lot of property in Tower Hamlets. Some of it's being rented out. In fact, one of the things I've been helping people with is actually people are trying to rent some of the council-owned shops and not being able to get through to people, and their emails aren't being answered. So actually, we're losing income in some respects. But yes, there is a concern, given the drugs trade, is that we need to make sure that the right people are using our properties. And the other issue for us as well is that we know community groups actually really struggle to find space.
Yeah.
And it's a bit annoying that people involved in growing cannabis can find space, but not real community groups out there. So I think that's the other key lesson for us, is we need to manage our property, whether it's directly our responsibility or whether it's something that we have a property interest in.
So in terms of next step, would you be minded to the council? Would you be minded as a audit member to ask them to put it on the risk register, like the use of our council properties? So there is actually some kind of audit done on it. What's your take, and what do you think should be the next steps in this?
Well, I think a particular problem that we've got is we know a lot of our council officers don't live in Tower Hamlets, and because of the pandemic and working from home, we probably have less council officers around than we've ever had. So inevitably there's more coming, there's more stuff happening because they're just not that aware. But there is a sort of overview and scrutiny committee. I have a kind of workshop session next Saturday and the following Saturday, where we're kind of looking at things that we need to work on. So I'm working on a list of issues. But yes, audit committee as well. I think we need to probably do a similar list of things that we need to follow up on. And I think kind of property management is kind of one of them.
No. So watch this space, guys. Let's see if the police discover any more cannabis farms in Tower Hamlets and who the actual landlord is. And let's hope it's not Tower Hamlets Council, but it is a major issue. And on a serious note, drugs is a massive issue. We have one of the highest number of drug users in the borough. So the drugs trade has a massive impact. And I know in terms of police and crime, they're more focusing on the financial aspects of it to tackle it. And it'd be kind of worrying if the council is aiding and abetting people in the drugs trade, not just in growing drugs, but also laundering their money as well. So it is a massive issue. So we're going to go to a break. So after the break, we're going to discuss air pollution. So air pollution has become a massive issue in Tower Hamlets and in London. It does have an impact on people's health, but we need to. Andrew's got some interesting analysis as to what is happening with air pollution in Tower Hamlets. So join us after the break when we discuss air pollution. What is the actual facts around it? Hi everyone, welcome back to the Weekly Politics Show with myself, host Councillor Puru, with co-host Councillor Andrew Wood. So in this section we're going to discuss air pollution. So air pollution is a topic that is kind of dominating a lot of the discussion in Tower Hamlets and London-wide as well. It's a driver behind a lot of the policies, some of them are controversial, like the low traffic neighbourhoods or livable streets in Tower Hamlets, and also other transport issues as well, like the 24-hour bus routes, which has caused issues in certain parts of our borough and in other parts of London. So, Andrew, what's the situation with air pollution? Is it? Do you want to just give us your take on your analysis of just looking at this issue?
So we had a scrutiny committee meeting, I think a private one last week, where we were going to have presentations about air quality and what the council were doing about it. And we had a presentation sent to us the day before. And I kind of looked at it and thought, this doesn't look right, because they're using these, and some people may have seen these maps. There was these maps that the GLA did back in 2016. And the data came largely from 2013, and it's a map of Tower Hamlets with how bad air quality is across, in each individual area. And I had some issues with how they produced the maps, because I know the methodology behind it, and I kind of thought that doesn't look right. And also, this is really old data; it's 8 years ago. So I actually started looking at the air data quality that the council themselves produce. And it was really interesting because I'd never really had the time to kind of sit down and sort of do it properly before. But actually, the air quality in Tower Hamlets as a whole, and there are some exceptions I'll talk about in a minute, have actually been improving. And one way of kind of proving it to you just kind of on screen is that if you've got the Love Your Neighbourhood app on your smartphone, so I'm just going to sort of, well, you probably can't see it very well, but it has a breathe clean sort of thing there. I don't know if you can see that, but it basically says low today, low tomorrow, and low on Sunday, which means air pollution is low. So green is good, in other words, and it's like that pretty much every day. So when I looked at the data, we actually have 4 permanent air quality monitoring stations around the borough, 2 in Parks, Victoria and Millwall, and then 2 by the roadside. So one by the sort of close to the sort of on the A12. And we've also got 90 NOx glass tubes around the area. The 4 monitoring stations are really good because they're live, they're online. You can get really good detailed data from a range of different pollutants, and you can graph it, and you can do that either online or as I've done on Excel. And for the NOx canisters, these glass canisters, they're not live, they're not online, and they only capture air, pollution over a 1-month period. But what you can do, and they've uploaded the results to a spreadsheet, is you can see the results from 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2019. And in 2020, it doesn't work. And basically what's been happening is air quality, so I'm trying to get my finger on screen, has been going down, i.e. the level of pollutants has been going down, despite the fact that the number of vehicles driving through Tower Hamlets has actually been going up. So how are those two things possible? It's because of the Euro emission standards. So if you've bought a car or got a car, you may be aware that the car engine technology, that the standards have been changing over the years. So for example, ULEZ, you can only drive a diesel vehicle if the engine is a Euro emission standard 6. I've got a diesel vehicle which is Euro emission standard 4, which was good enough, but it won't be good enough from this October. So car engines have been getting cleaner, and the average age of a car is about 8 years. So the air quality that we have today, 50% of the vehicles driving on the roads today were bought after 2013, and there were big, changes to, engines in 2011. So we're starting to see the benefit of those historical changes to engine standards. More hybrid vehicles, more electric vehicles. I saw a London Fire Brigade, little BMW i3 today, electric vehicles. The London Fire Brigade are using electric vehicles as well. And this is all actually having an impact on Tower Hamlets. But it's not universals. It's not like equally good air pollution across the whole area. It's very clear that the two worst areas for air pollution are near the tunnels. So Blackwall Tunnel is where we have the worst air quality, and also by the Rotherhithe and also the Limehouse Link, because again that's another tunnel, is where we have the worst air quality. But with those two exceptions, where they are bad, is actually the rest of the area is either below WHO standard. So in terms of NOx, nitrogen dioxide, in 2019 is actually on average across the whole of Tower Hamlets. We were below World Health Organization targets. There are some areas which are exceptions, but the last thing I'll sort of say on this bit is that the GLA think that when the ULEZ is introduced to Tower Hamlets in October of this year, it will reduce air pollution by 30%. And it's entirely possible, with the exception of those two areas, that could mean that actually pretty much the whole of Tower Hamlets is compliant in terms of air quality targets, assuming there's no big changes in vehicle movements. But the problem with LTNs is what they're doing is they're moving vehicles from kind of being all over the place to being more focused on the big roads. So my concern now actually is LTNs may actually push pollution towards certain roads and make them worse than they are today. And therefore we'll have a two-track Tower Hamlets, is that we'll have areas which are already experiencing better air quality, maybe even better air quality, in other areas worse. And I think the interesting thing is none of, in the presentation that we were sent, is some of the wording indicates this. So I think council officers are kind of aware of this, but none of the pictures, none of the graphics represented any of this. So one of the things I've been working on is my own presentation, which I'll put on Twitter at some point, to kind of demonstrate all the things that I've just said. And it does basically show that contrary to what you might think, is air quality hasn't been improving in Tower Hamlets for the last number of years.
No, definitely. I think there needs to be also debate as to the contributors of air pollution. Like heavy goods vehicles are one of the largest contributors of air pollution in Tower Hamlets. A lot of the traffic generated is through traffic. It's not but inter-borough traffic. And then we don't know what the impact of London City Airport is in a lot of it as well. And because of the pandemic, those airplanes have reduced, but we don't seem to have factored it in. I always feel like when discussion used to come up, I go, what's the impact of London City Airport, and do we have a strategy towards that as well? But I know the Overview and Scrutiny Committee are doing a challenge session. Is that correct on this? Do you want to just talk about what a challenge session is and when is it, and is it viewed live? Is it something that members of the public can view live, and can they contribute towards it as well?
So the challenge session is a meeting I was talking about sort of last week. So the idea is that Overview and Scrutiny pick every year some topics to dive into more detail on. So what we'll have is we'll have separate meetings. We'll have officers prepare a presentation for us, which is the one that I was talking about, that I didn't agree with the pictures that they were using and the maps they were using. There's then a sort of meeting, and this one was recorded, but I haven't seen it online yet. I need to check whether it's been put online or not. And then we have external people kind of come in and talk about the work that they're doing. And what will then happen is there will then be a report written by officers, and it will then come back to Overview and Scrutiny for review, and it will then go to Cabinet as this is what we think you need to do in terms of air quality, and it will make some recommendations, and then the Mayor will then review with Cabinet those recommendations and decide whether to accept or reject them or not. So in theory, it's a really good idea because it allows you to focus on one particular area, as long as the data you're looking at is correct. And as I said, I don't think the scrutiny challenge, which is what I pointed out, had the correct data in it. And unfortunately, there were some technical issues with the presentation. And I think part of the problem is the narrative is just so strong, is, oh, our air pollution is awful. And it is in some places. And the other thing I should have said as well is that most air pollutants have been getting better, but there's something called PM 2.5, which is the really small particles. But we've only been gathering data on that for the last couple of years, and therefore we don't have a real history of that. So it's harder to tell on PM 2.5 whether things have been getting better or not. So, but one of the recommendations we'll be making will be, we just need more data. We need more permanent air quality monitoring stations. And one of the really interesting things about when I was looking at it, so back in 2019, out of the 4 places where we have permanent monitoring stations, so Millwall Park, Victoria Park, on the A12 by Blackwall, or by the roadside, and by the roadside it's by in Stepney Green, so near Stepney Green underground station. Which of those 4 places do you think had the worst air quality in 2019 and 2020 as well? To have a think. It was actually Millwall Park. Millwall Park had the worst air quality of those 4 locations. And if you know Millwall Park, it's in the southern part of the Isle of Dogs. It's not near any major roads. So this is what I was saying, there's some real mysteries about air quality, and I would suggest that background pollution is as much of an issue as actually some of the roads are. But again, this all needs more work.
I'm a bit shocked by Millwall Park, because I used to live on the island for a period, and the impression I got, we've got a crosswind kind of ish that's blowing across the island, and so we're beneficial of that. So I'm a bit surprised by Millwall Park. It just seems obviously those assumptions are not there. But in terms of monitoring, I agree with you. There was this article, I think, the New York Times, where they did some monitoring of the New York subway system, where they found that it was really, really polluting people. That they were actually like they'd taken in more pollutants using the underground system than actually walking the streets, and it forced the New York Underground subway system to actually look at the air filtration systems and put in the investment. But it seems like it seems like a lot of it is based on conjecture rather than facts, and we need to have a fact-based approach. Is there a second bite at the cherry? Because my understanding is there's going to be a challenge session on low traffic neighborhoods, which a lot of the issues that you've picked up is going to be discussed on that. Is that correct, or in May or something like that? So
I know there's been talk about it. When it will happen, I'm not entirely sure. But I found on the council website a couple of days ago something called the air quality monitoring map, which shows the results from these NOx canisters, and it's really powerful. And I said I'll put this all on Twitter so you can see what I'm looking at as well. And it does raise some quite fundamental questions about what we're doing. So Bow already, according to this in 2019, actually had pretty good air quality, or certainly below WHO target. So the target is 40 UGM a year, and Bow had like 34 in 2019 on average. So well below the target. I mean, the other thing I'd say about is construction. So on the Isle of Dogs, we have a lot of construction, and we think that's a major cause of pollution and pollutants. Maybe that's why Millwall Park is particularly bad, because it is closer than the others to a lot of construction. But again, we don't have any air quality monitoring stations near construction sites. I mean, the developers collect this data, and in theory, we could ask for it, but I've never seen any data from the construction sites. So that's another area where we need to do more work. And yes, London City Airport is another good example. Noise, I've also said noise is also a pollutant as well. And we don't really currently collect any noise. I've been told that we will start doing that. But when I look at the map, basically the worst places are, as I said, near the 2 tunnels and Aldgate, and also some of the main roads leading in and out of Tower Hamlets. So the highway is particularly bad. So I think also anywhere where there's a lot of stop and start traffic jams, that does seem to be the areas where we've got higher than targets. But even then, even the highway it's not good, but it's not terrible either. It's only really bad by the 2 tunnels, according to the council's own analysis. Yeah.
Well, looks like watch this space. It's going to be discussion. I know the livable streets. We're going to do another tribunal. We're just going to publicize that. But it is part of that bigger mix of discussion, and we need to base it on facts, not conjecture or ideology. So we're going to go into a break. After the break, Andrew and I are going to discuss the London elections and what are the big issues. So hopefully after next week's program, hopefully Murad's going to be there. We're going to have another candidate there from another, hopefully from the Conservative Party, and then we could pose some questions. But before that, Andrew and I are just going to go through the main issues. So join us after the break for a breakdown of the London Assembly elections issues. So we're going to go to a break.
I'm Bashir Chaudhry, owner of All Seasons Letting, visiting Relax Radio. I'm very optimistic and very impressed that this radio station is going to be very useful for our community. Please download the app and keep listening.
Relax. Why read when you can listen? Relax Radio.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the weekly politics show with myself, Councillor Puru, and co-host Councillor Andrew Wood. So in this section, we're going to discuss the main issues around the London Assembly and mayoral elections. So on the 6th of May, we've all received the ballot. A lot of us are going to go out and vote. A lot of us are probably going to be encouraging you to vote as well. But what are the main issues in the capital, in London? So a lot of the issues we face in Tower Hamlets are also faced in other boroughs, and they seem to be a London-wide issue. So Andrew and I are going to just go through the main issues, which is crime, housing, and transport. And hopefully that will allow us next week, when we have Murad and hopefully a Conservative candidate, we could pose some of the questions and see what their answers are. So, Andrew, do you want to kick off on the issue around crime? I know knife crime has been a massive topic in London. We're kind of fortunate. I've had fatal stabbings in my ward, but if you compare it to other boroughs, they're having like five or three. It's more or less become an epidemic in terms of knife crime and gang related crime, and all the associated issues like people on mopeds, grabbing people's phones and all that kind of stuff. Andrew, what are the, in terms of policing and crime, what are the main issues that both political parties need to cover in terms of what's happening in London?
Yeah, so first of all, as a reminder, so the Mayor of London has something called MOPAC, which is the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime. And they're basically responsible for the Met Police in terms of the direction and the finances of it. MOPAC also has its own budget, so I know they do other things as well. And obviously they have some other powers. The difficulty the mayor has is that some of that responsibility is shared also with the Home Secretary, Priti Patel. So sometimes who's directly responsible, is it the mayor or Priti Patel, is slightly unclear, but certainly it would be true that the mayor and his deputy mayor, currently Sophie Linden, set the tone in terms of the day-to-day, not the day-to-day management of the police, but kind of what their direction, what they should be working towards. Yeah. And clearly, crime is a major issue in London. I'm also aware that other boroughs have got it particularly bad, and even within Tower Hamlets, some areas have got it worse than others. There's been a lot of talk about what's called the Glasgow model, which is basically you treat serious crime like this as actually a health issue, and you kind of approach it in a completely different way. So rather than the kind of just the policing only, will arrest you and throw you in jail approach, You try and look at the causes of crime, and you try and divert people away from crime. And that's kind of been an interesting debate that's kind of been going on in the past over the years. And obviously, it's not just about policing, because obviously there are other parts of the criminal justice system that the mayor doesn't control. So there's no point arresting people if the courts are busy and then don't jail people. But at the end of the day, the mayor still has, probably more responsibility for crime and crime management than any other person, with the exception of perhaps Priti Patel. And I think, this has been a weakness of the mayor, is that, crime has gone up. But I'm as a councillor, I'm not entirely sure what Mopac and the mayor are doing about it. I know they've had issues with finances. One of the good pieces of news is I talking to the police recently, is they were saying is actually police numbers in Tower Hamlets are going up again, because there was a period when they were going down, and they have gone up, and therefore the police have kind of got more resources now than perhaps they had a couple of years ago, but perhaps still not in proportion to the increase in the population. So.
Yeah, I know the Metropolitan Police has gone on a recruitment drive. I know some retired police officers have been asked to come back in other capacities. So it does seem like there's more resources or more emphasis. It seems to be moving away from, say, frontline to more intelligence-based. They're sort of like training people to directly become detectives, rather than go through the police constabulary route into that. But it is a discussion that does dominate conversations on the doorstep and on the radio waves as well. The other big massive issue is housing. I know there's some interesting stuff coming out of the GLA. And Andrew, have you spotted these sort of like the small sites that the Mayor of London is giving out? And it's kind of interesting that they're allowing like small community groups to build, either self-build or small type of social housing. There's one site around the corner from where I live, in Christian Street, that's up, but they seem to be dotted all over. What's your take on that? So like having a mix of housing providers, is that the right way forward, or what's your take?
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. I think one of the problems I think we have in England is that we have too few people building homes, and they tend to be the big private sector developers, plus some of the housing associations. And I know in the civil, we were building more homes in the 50s and 60s. That was also because we had lots of smaller companies involved, kind of building homes, maybe not so much in London, but certainly outside of London. And because the planning system is so difficult and complicated and bureaucratic, is a lot of them, especially during the last financial crisis, kind of lost their way. So I think anything that brings in new people into the market who can build or develop homes, I think can only be but a good thing. The reason why I was smiling when you said small sites, I thought you were talking about something in the London plan. There was a dispute between the Mayor of London and the outer London boroughs, because in the London plan, which has now been adopted in March, so it's a month old now, he was basically trying to get more homes built in the outer London boroughs through small sites, and having higher housing targets on these small sites, and the outer London boroughs not being very happy with that. And there was a bit of a political bun fight between them and the mayor on that, because this has always been the difficulty is, we have to build X number of houses in London, and not all local authorities are as keen as Tower Hamlets to build those homes. And therefore, that's been one of the problems. And in the end, he had to withdraw that because the examiners didn't agree with him. But it also then meant is that his London plan, in theory, but this is pre-COVID, wasn't going to deliver enough homes to actually meet London's housing needs. Whether that will change because of COVID, we don't know. But the other power that he's got, Transport for London own a lot of land. So one of the things that's happening in East London, so in Newham and eventually in Tower Hamlets, may well be that the mayor himself is using Transport for London land to actually build his own home, so to speak. And that could be very interesting if that really gets going. And so far it hasn't really happened yet, but that could be a big change if it does happen.
Yeah, that's been a discussion, I think, both political parties. I remember when the elections happened 5 years ago, both Zach Goldsmith and Mayor Sadiq Khan said that they want to release that TFL land, and it's kind of like going back to the tradition. A lot of people don't realize, but the largest house builder in London was the London City Council, the LCC. They built the most number of houses, more than the local authorities. So a good example is, I think, the Boundary Estate is an LCC, and it's actually the first social housing estate purpose built in the UK. But that set the tone, and they look similar as well. They got that red brick kind of look to them, and it's sort of like trying to get back to that tradition. So housing is a massive issue, and then what's your take on rent controls, Andrew? Is rent controls a way forward? This is probably the bit when Andrew and I disagree on it.
I actually, so when I read that, I actually tweeted 3 documents. So The Economist did some examination of the rent controls in Berlin and basically found that it reduced housing supply. So the evidence from other areas is as not as supportive of the policy as proponents might think. So it'd be an interesting debate, that one. My personal view is that they're okay in the very short term, but in the long term, they have unintended consequences. And the evidence would suggest, and I did tweet, I have to find my tweet again. I wasn't expecting to get an answer on this. I think there was an article in New York Times as well, maybe, is that when you actually look at where this has been done in other places, it has caused issues. And I think the only solution to this problem is we have to build more homes. And in my personal view, that includes on the Greenbelt, but unfortunately, pretty much all of the major politicians and political parties, including the current mayor, Sadiq Khan, are not willing to build on the Greenbelt. But unless you do that, I don't see how we can ever build affordable housing in London. And in Germany, where my mum comes from, it's very common that you have houses. I mean, you still have lovely parks and lovely green areas. So it's not like completely, built over concrete jungles. So you can have, really nice homes and green areas, and not have a green belt. So that's my view on that one. So.
No, it is an interesting debate, and I think it's gonna. We don't know what the impact of COVID is. There's more residentials going up in the City of London as well, and that's going to be interesting. They've had interesting debates in that council chamber in the City of London, and so it's going to be an interesting kind of debate and something to watch out for as well. We're nearly at the end of the program. So hopefully next week we're going to have Murad and hopefully a Conservative candidate up, and we could, contact Andrew and me for questions that you want to pose to them. I know one of the questions that is going to be posed is the issues around low traffic neighborhoods and the impact it has on families that rely on the car as a means of income. But if there's any other questions you've got, we're happy to pose it to both candidates and get their perspective on things. And let's see how it goes. But we're near the end of the program. Andrew, is there any final things you want to say to the listeners in terms of London or what's coming up next, what to look out for next week?
Well, I guess probably the main thing to kind of say is that the polling cards have all been sent out. I've had 3 because on the Isle of Dogs we've got 3 of them. So if you haven't had your polling card, it means you're probably not registered to vote, and you've got until the 19th of April to register to vote. So that's probably the key message. And also the census. If you haven't done your census, please do your census forms as well.
So polling cards, if you haven't got it, you need to apply for it, and guys, get those census forms in. But thank you again for watching the weekly politics show with myself, Councillor Puru, and co-host Councillor Andrew Wood. Enjoy the weekend, and we look forward to seeing you next Friday, hopefully with Murad and a Conservative candidate. And you never know, they might have some sparks flying. But thank you again for watching the show, and enjoy the weekend. Thank you very much.